Good morning and good afternoon. On behalf of the Bureau of Justice Assistance, thank you all for joining us for today's webinar on the effects of body-worn cameras on organizational and individual outcomes. I'm Brittany Cunningham, the project manager for the Body-Worn Camera Training and Technical Assistance Program. Today's webinar conveys recent research information and findings regarding the impacts that body-worn cameras have on both individuals and police organizations. As the evidence regarding the impacts of body-worn cameras grows and advances, we think it's important to share these findings with researchers and practitioners. Most importantly, we want to make these findings available to implementers of body-worn camera programs so they can benefit from what research is telling us. Today's webinar features presentations from 3 researchers who will share their findings from recent research. Dr. Jessica Huff from the University of Nebraska, Omaha, Dr. Eric Piza from John Jay College, and Dr. Vaughn Crichlow from the Florida Atlantic University. They'll be joined by Dr. Michael White and Dr. Eileen Mom, who are also accomplished body-worn camera researchers and members of our technical assistance team. I'd like to thank them for sharing their work and their time with us today. On behalf of our team, I also want to thank the Bureau of Justice Assistance for its investment in the Body-Worn Camera Grant Program and in the range of technical assistance resources and opportunities provided for agencies implementing body-worn cameras. I also want to thank Quinn Patterson and the CNA team behind the scenes helping to support today's webinar. The webinar is being recorded for the benefit of others who may view it later and will be posted on our body-worn camera website. We encourage you to make your thoughts and questions known during the webinar. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit questions. The presenters and facilitators will address as many questions at the end of the webinar as time allows. I will note if you weren't able to join us for part 1 of this webinar, it was posted on the Body-Worn Camera Training and Technical Assistance website if you're interested in viewing it. Following the webinar, you will receive a request to evaluate it. Please complete the evaluation and give us your honest thoughts and recommendations. Again, thank you all for joining today. I will now turn it over and introduce you to Dr. Mike White. Mike.
Thanks, Brittany. I just want to take a couple of minutes to set the stage for what we're going to hear from our 3 presenters. And oftentimes when innovation occurs in criminal justice, we researchers are late to the party. The train's left the station, agencies are adopting whatever innovation it is, and we're left chasing the train trying to build up an evidence base. And that happened a little bit with body-worn cameras, but not so much as in other innovations. If you think about how quickly the evidence base has grown, it's actually really remarkable. You know, as recently as 2015, there were maybe 5 studies that had been completed, and several of them weren't very good. Fast forward to now, 2022, there are well over 100 studies. A bunch of randomized controlled trials, a bunch of really rigorous, important studies have been done. So it's really quite dizzying in some respects in terms of the rapid growth. In some ways, the evidence base has grown as quickly as the diffusion of the cameras themselves. And that's a positive thing. But with that growth comes challenges. And certainly one of the challenges for researchers, but for everybody, is simply how to keep up. For a while there, it seemed like there was a new study that was out every week. And it just, in so many different outlets, you'd see them in academic journals, from the top tier journals to, journals I've never even heard of, department internal reports, media reports, student dissertations. I mean, it was coming fast and furious. And that's, I think, still really the case. So that's been one challenge, is just trying to keep a handle on things as they come out. The other is that sometimes there's not a whole lot of agreement. You'll have 2 studies come out within a week and they say exactly the opposite thing. And what does that mean? So that certainly is one challenge. And the last, I think, is if you look back, some of those early studies were really all of the early studies on body cameras in 2013, 14, 15. They focused on 2 outcomes. It was the impact on use of force by officers. It was the impact on citizen complaints. And the research now in 2022 looks at many more different kinds of outcomes, probably a dozen or more different kinds of outcomes, from procedural justice to, officer activity like making arrests and issuing tickets, to court outcomes. It's just a much broader array of outcomes, which makes things much more complicated. So, one of the jobs that we have, researchers on this TTA team, is to try to make sense of it all. And that's certainly a challenge. There are a couple of things that we do. One, we've created research directories, which can be found at this link here you see on the slide. And essentially, we tried to create a user-friendly resource that would summarize all of the studies on a given outcome. So you could go and you could look at, okay, here are all the studies on use of force. What do they say? Here are all the studies that look at officer perceptions. Here's what they say. So that's one thing we've done. The other is we try to have webinars like this, where we bring together folks who are actively engaged in the research, and we ask them to talk about kind of the latest and greatest of what they're up to. And so today we're going to hear from three researchers who are really at the cutting edge of body-worn camera research in 2022. And Dr. Jessica Huff from UNO, Dr. Eric Piza from John Jay, and Dr. Vaughn Crichlow from Florida Atlantic University. So, I'm going to turn it over to them. We intend for this webinar to be a little more discussion based than we academics are typically used to. So they're each going to give a kind of a brief talk about what they're up to. And then Dr. Ali Imam's going to lead a Q&A both with our participants and then also with the audience if there are any questions. So I think at this point, I think Dr. Huff's up first, and I'll turn it over to her.
All right. Thank you, Mike and Brittany, for the introduction, and Quinn for organizing everything. I am very excited to be here with all of you today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jessie Huff, and I am an assistant professor at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. Today, I'm going to be talking about body-worn camera activation, why it matters, predicting compliance, and future considerations. I'm not going to be talking about one specific study, but rather a couple of different projects I've worked on, looking at activation from a few different angles. But if you have any questions about the specific studies, please feel free to reach out. I'm happy to share those papers or talk about this further. So I think it helps to start with just kind of a general discussion of the goals of body-worn cameras. We've all seen, a ton of different goals associated with these programs, but probably some of the most common are facilitating transparency and accountability in policing. Policing has traditionally occurred in a very private environment where officer decision-making is kind of one-on-one on the street. But body-worn cameras are really allowing us this unique opportunity to see what individual officers are doing during specific interactions and then hold them accountable for those behaviors. This also has huge evidentiary value. We can now use this technology in court to kind of see, this is what an officer saw, this is how they reacted to that situation. A lot of times when there are contentious use of force incidents, we also see proponents of body-worn cameras come out and say, we should be adopting this technology in some way to reduce racial and ethnic disparities in policing as well. And there has been less evidence looking at the influence of body-worn cameras on this outcome, but there does certainly seem to be a tie between these types of incidents and then calls for body-worn camera adoption. So how do we get there? All of these goals sound really great, right? The impact of body-worn cameras is often described using kind of deterrence and self-awareness perspectives. It's basically the idea that an officer knows that what they're doing can later be reviewed by the community, by their sergeant, by someone else who can really see how the officer behaved in that encounter. And this could in turn constrain police discretion. Officers could react to this by becoming more legalistic and behaving in ways that are more consistent with established policies and with laws and procedures. This can also foster a civilizing effect on both the officer and the civilian that they're interacting with, who could become more civil, behave better, more respectful towards each other as a result of this body-worn camera, which is providing evidence of what's going on. So all of this sounds great, right? So we should put these body-worn cameras out, get them to officers on the streets so we can start achieving these goals. But these benefits really kind of depend on officers actually turning these cameras on and on this footage being recorded. So what's the difference here? To use kind of the classic and maybe tired medical example, it's a little bit like being sick and going to the doctor. So you're sick, you go to the doctor says, okay, I'm going to prescribe you this pill that will make you feel better. And some people may take the pill every single day, every single time they have symptoms flare up. Other people may say, I don't really like pills, I don't really want to take it, I'm not going to take the pill. But if we later want to study, okay, does this pill make you better? Did this make you healthy? There's a difference between looking at the effect of giving you the pill and looking at the effect of you actually taking the pill. So some of my colleagues and I at Arizona State University wanted to look at body-worn cameras the same way. We wanted to see, is there a difference between assigning cameras to officers, having them wear the camera, and what happens when officers who are wearing the cameras are actually turning them on? So to look at this, we used some data from a randomized controlled trial in the Phoenix Police Department, and we used an intent to treat and a treatment on the treated type approach. And what we found was that body-worn camera assignment by itself had relatively limited impact on what officers were doing in the field. However, officers who were wearing cameras, who turned those cameras on, significantly increased the likelihood of an arrest occurring, and it also significantly reduced the likelihood of a civilian complaint. So we found that, the benefits of body-worn cameras really were tied to whether or not an officer was turning it on. This was actually maximizing the effect of this technology on the outcome of those particular incidents. So my colleague Chuck Katz and I wanted to take this a step further. So we said, okay, we know activation matters. This is, driving some differences in what we're finding. What are some of the factors that are predicting activation compliance? So again, using data from the Phoenix Police Department, we looked at a huge number of variables to figure out, what is causing these differences between, officers turning their cameras on and officers not turning their cameras on. So at the situational level, we found that officers were generally less likely to activate their camera during subject stops and during traffic stops, as well as during proactive contacts compared to civilian requests for service. We also identified some limited officer level differences. For whatever reason, male officers were more likely to activate than their female counterparts. And we also identified variation across precincts. Officers assigned to some places in Phoenix were more likely to activate than others. Within the Phoenix Police Department, the way body-worn camera reviews work is sergeants are required to randomly look at footage for their officers who are wearing cameras on a monthly basis. And so we speculate, it's possible that in some precincts, this was taken very seriously. Sergeants were reviewing this footage. They were holding officers accountable. This may not have been the case in other places where officers were a little bit less likely to activate because there wasn't that built-in accountability mechanism there. We identified relatively limited differences across neighborhoods, with the exception that officers were less likely to activate their cameras in neighborhoods with larger Hispanic populations. But this was a relatively small effect. The largest and most pronounced and probably the most important and interesting finding in our study was that organizational policy had a really strong influence on body-worn camera activation. In the Phoenix Police Department, at the beginning of our study, officers were required to activate their camera anytime they were involved in an enforcement contact. So this was generally defined to be pretty much any police-civilian encounter. A couple of months into our study, one of the officers who was assigned to wear a body-worn camera was involved in an officer-involved shooting. That officer had been on the scene of the incident for about 15 minutes when that shooting occurred, but they had not activated their body-worn camera. This resulted in an immediate change to the policy, which now requires officers to activate as soon as they receive a call for service, so before ever getting out of their patrol car. So this really constrained officer discretion on when to activate that camera, ensuring that, that camera would be activated if something were to occur. So prior to that policy change, officers were activating their cameras about 50% of the time, or in about half of the encounters that they were engaged in with civilians. There was an immediate spike in activation compliance after this change was announced. It jumped up to about 84% and kind of remained level throughout the remainder of the study period, hovering between about 70, 75, and 80% activation compliance. So in terms of future considerations, I think what all of this means for me really is that this activation issue matters. We want to see, the benefits and the goals of body-worn cameras being met. We need to make sure that that footage is being created. So one of the things I mentioned as, a goal that has received a little bit less attention at the beginning of this study was the potential for body-worn cameras to reduce racial and ethnic disparities. And this was something I was really interested in during my dissertation research. I really wanted to understand, we're deploying these body-worn cameras. Are they changing the way officers are behaving in different types of neighborhoods and different types of communities? And so I looked at behaviors in Phoenix, and I found that officers were more likely to conduct arrests in neighborhoods with larger Black populations, both before and after cameras were deployed. But when I focused in on whether, body-worn camera activation mattered for this behavior, I did find that officers were less likely to conduct arrests in Black neighborhoods when their cameras were turned on. So it is supporting this idea that using body-worn cameras in different places can influence officer behavior. So I would like to note that body-worn camera technology itself is changing. A lot of companies are coming out with technologies that will automatically activate, anytime an officer pulls a firearm, pulls a taser, turns on their lights and sirens, in some cases unclicking their seatbelt. So it's kind of taking the human element out of this activation decision. So what really matters now is how we leverage this information that we're gaining from body-worn camera footage. Like, how are we going to use this opportunity to see what police officers are doing in different situations to really achieve these goals that we set out to achieve, to enhance supervision and training, to encourage professionalism, and to ensure that officers are behaving, in kind of fair and consistent ways across places. So I will go ahead and conclude there, but I look forward to discussing with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you for having me today. Very excited to be here and talk about a project that my colleague Victoria Seitzma of Queen's University and I have been leading for about the last, we'll say 18 months to 2 years, where essentially what we've been focusing on is applying systematic social observational techniques to body camera footage to understand a little bit more about police use of force events. The Charles Koch Foundation has graciously funded this effort over the last 2 years. Now, police use of force is arguably the preeminent criminal justice issue of our time. So why is that? At the risk of oversimplifying things a bit too much, I think one key aspect is the fact that high-profile use of force events for the last decade or so have been filmed and then immediately shared and gone, as the kids say, viral, garnering a lot of public attention. Now, since that's the case, right, we also think that video can be leveraged in a similar way to help inform evidence-based police practice and reform around the issue of use of force. In particular, the rapid spread of body camera means something pretty important from this perspective. Specifically, since we are now recording police-citizen interactions in any agency, or rather all agencies that deploy body cameras, we now have the opportunity to observe and record these types of interactions at a level of detail that was impossible not that long ago. That means that also there's some pretty interesting and exciting research opportunities available to the field. So what we did here is we partnered on a project with the Newark Police Division that treated body cameras as a data collection research tool, right? So rather than test the effect of body cameras on police and citizen actions, we focused on using the footage recorded via body cameras to understand the nature of police-citizen interactions during specifically use of force events. So we observed and coded 91 use of force incidents that were recorded in their entirety during the Newark Police Department's initial body camera rollouts. In total, just to give a sense of the effort involved in this, it took us a little bit more than 300 hours to accomplish that over about an 8-month period. Now, 91 is not the largest sample size, to be perfectly frank, but it is comparable to other research that have applied observational methods to video footage, be it body cameras or video surveillance cameras and such. And I'll pause that. I'll kind of stop there, and because I could go down a pretty deep rabbit hole on the sample issue. We were basically interested in coding 2 different types of variables in each video that we collected. First, we were interested in what we refer to as static measures, which were time-stable characteristics of the event. Second, we coded dynamic measures, which were mostly actions and behaviors that changed, ebbed, and flowed over each individual event. Now, it's easiest, I think, to explain our coding approach through an applied example. I don't have permission to actually show or share videos from our project, unfortunately, but I did find an example from YouTube that I think fits the context of what we were seeing in Newark, New Jersey. We don't have time to watch that together, but in the event anyone is interested in seeing that video, you can do so at the below URL. Well, the URL over to the right of the slide. Now, if that video were part of our sample, it would have been coded in the following way. At the outset of the video, the suspect admits in his own words to, quote, drinking for quite a while, pretty much all day, and I'm having trouble standing up, end quote. So we code that as a clear example of a suspect being under the influence of drugs or alcohol. We also coded a number of variables, as you see, on the nature of the setting and time of occurrence. Lastly, the nature of suspect interactions with other people on the scene and whether a weapon was involved were coded as the final few static variables. We also captured the start and end time for a range of dynamic variables as well. Now, the dynamic variables largely relates to the actions and behaviors, as well as the arrival and departure of everyone on scene. You see here, while most variables occurred only over a single time interval, some did happen at multiple points during the event, and those were reflected in our databases. For example, the officers in this incident allowed the suspect to explain his side of the incident for 11 seconds at 21:24, and then offered the suspect an additional opportunity to explain their side of the story for 2 seconds at 21:27. Officers later issued a comm command that lasted about 4 seconds and followed that up with another comm command a few minutes later that lasted 7 seconds. We then triangulated the coded body camera data with other Newark Police data sources, specifically calls for service, arrest. We were able to gain sociodemographic information from officers from human resources records. We used census data to get information on the sociodemographics of the neighborhoods. So this allowed us to include a rich range of measures, both specific to the footage, specific to other data sources relating to the events and all of the participants. Using this larger data set, we essentially reported findings of our analyses across 5 published and currently under review studies. The studies that have been published already are listed, have URLs rather at the end of this slide if anyone is interested in seeing them. The in-progress studies, if anyone's interested in seeing kind of in-progress versions of those, I'm happy to share those as well. So quickly, the first study provides an in-depth overview of our study methodology, as well as the benefits and challenges of doing this types of observational research. The second study uses body camera footage to measure police officer adherence to procedural justice. The third study conducts a script analysis to identify common sequential stages of use of force escalation, right? So essentially when officers bypass soft force and go straight to a harder level of force. The fourth study applies survival analysis techniques to test the effect of suspect and officer actions on how quickly or far into an event force is used. The fifth and final study takes each individual interaction, breaks them up into 5-second intervals for the purpose of measuring exactly how each variable influences use of force, both in the immediate as well as the subsequent time periods. So in considering the overall results of these 5 studies, some important themes emerge. For one, officers generally did adhere to the use of force continuum in our sample. Escalating verbal commands typically did precede use of force. On the other end of the spectrum, officers informed citizens of body camera presence in only 41% of cases. Now, we find that a little problematic because if we're expecting body cameras to generate a civilizing effect, then we probably would like to see that number to be a little bit higher. Like prior research, we find the nature of suspect behavior has a very strong influence on officer decisions to use force. Suspects under the influence of alcohol or drugs was part of the highest risk force escalation script. Suspects acting aggressively or disobeying officer commands significantly increased the risk of force in the immediate 5-second interval. Our research, however, also suggests a potential important role of bystanders. In our script analysis, incidents where the victim was still present on scene when officers arrived were associated with the highest risk of escalation via the script analysis. From a potential policy and training standpoint, procedural justice emerged as an important theme. Adherence to procedural justice is consistently associated with reduced risk of escalation in our script analysis. We also found that when officers use consistently respectful, non-antagonistic tones to suspects, the time to force is significantly delayed. And also, when officers explain the reason for detainment to suspects, the risk of force significantly decreases over the next 30 seconds of the event. However, officers may not use procedural justice enough, at least in our sample. Officers consistently using respectful language and answering suspect questions occurred in less than half cases. We were hoping to see that a little higher. And when considering the 8 separate measures of procedural justice together, slightly more than half of cases scored between 0 and 4. In other words, more than half of cases, at least 4 of the 8 procedural justice measures were completely absent. And that's all I have. Didn't introduce myself at the top. Eric Piza, John Jay College. Feel free to reach out to me via email or social media if you would like more information. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesse and Eric. I think that it's suitable that I would go third because I'm going to look at what's happening in Florida within the context of police community relations. But first, let me just introduce myself to the audience. I'm Vaughn Crichlow. I am an associate professor here at Florida Atlantic University, as well as the Associate Dean of the College of Social Work and Criminal Justice. And I've been conducting body-worn camera related research since 2015 with 2 different teams of researchers and predominantly in the state of Florida. Now, why Florida? What's interesting about Florida? Well, there's several things that I could come up with. Almost everything that you could think of in terms of issues that police officers face in the community, as well as socioeconomic dynamics that impact perceptions towards authority across the country. You could find a microcosm of that here in this state, as well as when you look at the demographics and the racial, ethnic, and cultural diversity. It really provides an opportunity to look at perceptions of various groups across culture, across space. And it's interesting to see the findings as they play out, both looking at survey research as well as qualitative interviews. And so I've used, along with my colleagues, mixed methods approaches ever since 2015 to really try to understand police officer perceptions in terms of the use of body-worn cameras and the effectiveness of them, as well as from the community side in terms of their perceptions. And so there are about 387 law enforcement agencies in this state, and approximately 120 have implemented BWCs for some or all of their officers. That's about 32% of police agencies in the state. And of those who have implemented BWCs to some extent, about 50% have fully deployed them throughout their agencies. It's interesting, though, that there are several really large agencies that have not deployed BWCs, one of them being the Palm Beach Sheriff's Office that I work with quite a bit in the state of, in the county, Palm Beach County. And one of the main reasons for not implementing is the cost. And so for them, the cost at this time seems prohibitive, as well as they're not just concerned with actually getting the devices and maintaining those devices, but in terms of the storage and the personnel needed to properly implement effectively the usefulness of those cameras and the footage in terms of how that footage is stored and how it's used. And so when we look at community perceptions, the findings from a community survey, they suggest that public perceptions are generally favorable towards BWC use, and that is across counties where BWCs have been implemented and those in which they have not, across municipalities where you have BWCs and those where BWCs have not been implemented. Generally, the public have favorable perceptions towards the use of these cameras, and that's across racial groups. Racial minorities tend to see it as a positive thing, and there are calls for their local agencies to adopt BWCs, as well as in places where they are being used. The community is hopeful. Communities have been hopeful in terms of what this means for more transparency and accountability when it comes to policing their local neighborhoods. So looking at police perceptions, police perceptions at agencies, both with and without body-worn cameras, have similar concerns. There's a strong concern about unfavorable public perceptions towards police. And my colleagues and I, we published a book recently on police community relations in times of crisis. And one of our chapters, we really explore body-worn cameras and how they impact community perceptions, particularly when it comes to trust. And on the police side, it's interesting to see that while police expect that a complete narrative of what really happened during those encounters would reduce those frivolous complaints, and a lot of officers that I've spoken to and interviewed are really concerned about these frivolous complaints. Now the public will see what really happened. Now they'll see what really happened. And it's an opportunity to foster a culture in which maybe police could be perceived the way they should be, that they are the ones going out there trying to really help the community and really improve the quality of life. Whereas on the community side, there's a strong feeling of distrust, particularly among communities of color, that, well, with the adoption of these BWCs, our expectation is that we'd be able to hold officers accountable now. We can hold them accountable and maybe finally we'll get justice. So it's this whole issue of community trust is something that's not a new concept. It's not a new consideration when you look at criminal justice research on the whole, looking at procedural justice issues, and my colleagues have just referred to procedural justice. And, it's not a new thing to be concerned about community-oriented policing and the impact on community trust. But with the adoption of BWCs, there was a lot of excitement around the opportunities here to really improve perceptions or procedural justice perceptions in the community. And what we've found is that perhaps we need to temper expectations. And so BWCs can be beneficial if we temper those expectations and train police. And so what we found is that in agencies that already were moving towards adopting more procedurally just practices, that there was in-service training for their personnel, that they had good relationships with researchers and external parties in terms of providing that transparency and having those conversations about policing. Those agencies that did that, they did a better job of incorporating BWCs into what they were doing, as opposed to simply adopting body-worn cameras and expecting that community trust will increase just because we have body-worn cameras. We found that community perceptions are not improving where that is concerned. And so BWCs will not improve citizens' trust in the absence of a broader community-oriented vision. And after we've seen all of these police-citizen encounters, what has been referred to previously as viral videos, all of those incidents of police officers apparently behaving badly or immorally or even criminally, that news travels. And so in some of the communities that we've gone into, even though they may not have recent incidents of police violence or police abuses, community members are affected by those images, by those videos that they see. And so it's not just about direct contact with police officers anymore. It's not just about vicarious contact in terms of what my family members or close friends have experienced with police. It's also about what we're seeing around the country. And that's impacting people in a real way, along with, of course, the political conversations and discourse that's happening right now. And so it really presents a challenge for policing in our time, such that while the body-worn camera, the use of it, and whether it's activated or not, are extremely important considerations, how we use that footage, the laws that are developed around body-worn cameras, whether or not footage can be released to the public, and all of these issues are extremely important. But when talking about restoring community trust, it seems that incorporating procedural justice as part of an organizational culture is extremely important. And this is something that if you were to go in and ask police chiefs about it, they will say, yes, we do procedural justice. Yes, we're all about community-oriented policing and talking with the community and increasing trust. However, there are very few mechanisms in place to measure the effectiveness of those activities that command staff, that police chiefs engage in. Also, sustaining those partnerships with practitioners, researchers, and the community seem to be really key elements towards really changing culture and developing an agency that can really withstand a lot of the conflicts that are out there in the community. Also sharing knowledge openly and using evidence to inform practice. And so I think that there is a need for a conversation about incorporating the use of body-worn cameras into a broader plan when it comes to increasing community trust. And so we have several manuscripts that we're working on right now towards that end to try to shine a light on these issues. These are very complicated issues. It's not easy, and it's difficult to find a definitive answer. But what it really seems like is that the answer cannot lie with the police alone. This is much larger than police. It's not just a policing issue. It seems like all hands are needed on deck in order to really address the community trust issue. However, body-worn cameras are a good sign in terms of stepping in the right direction, particularly if we're talking about transparency. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. And we had such wonderful presentations. They're all very different, but I hope you saw the themes that were going through all of the presentations, and they make my job quite easy. And also difficult because they answered all of the questions that I had. So trying to think on the fly here. But one of the key themes that came out was that body-worn cameras are a tool. And this is a common refrain that we've heard over and over and over again as the research base has grown. Body-worn cameras are a tool. They can be useful in building police accountability, transparency, community trust, reducing use of force, and even possibly reducing racial and ethnic disparity in the criminal justice system. And we heard that here, but they won't be as effective if you use them alone, and certainly not if they're not turned on. So body-worn cameras without adequate training and policies on things like activation and procedural justice produce really variable results. And so this is where I'd like to start our discussion today. But before I do that, I wanted to let John Markovic have a couple comments, and then we will go into our Q&A for the panelists.
These have been great presentations, and I will probably have some questions as you open it up to questions, Allie. But I just posted something in the chat about our new solicitation. There are 3 new categories in the solicitation. As I see, I don't think the link came through, but if you search for the fiscal year 2022 body-worn camera policy and implementation program, you should get a link to the solicitation. Or if you email me at john.markovic@ojp.usdoj.gov, I can provide you that link. I would say we've got these 3 new purpose areas that have to do with agencies using digital evidence. So one has to do with digital evidence integration. So it's really agencies that have moved the needle and want to move the needle further and are willing to share their experiences. The funding goes to law enforcement agencies or prosecutors' offices, but research partners or academics working with them doing operational research or evaluation research are certainly allowable. So you may want some of you academics or others on the call may want to partner with an existing law enforcement agency. The other category has to do with prosecutors leveraging body-worn camera footage for decision-making, leveraging the evidentiary value, again, demonstration project, sort of moving the needle. And then final one is, I think dovetails with these presentations quite well, is law enforcement agencies that are leveraging body-worn cameras for constitutional policing or community outreach. So they may be doing de-escalation training with their own video. They may be releasing videos to the public in some purposeful way that enhances community policing or citizen engagement. One example is the critical incident reviews that LAPD has developed and other departments have emulated. So if you have questions, please feel free to email me. I've spoken longer than I wanted to, so I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thanks so much, John. All right, so we're going to start with our questions, and we have one from the audience first, and I'll go to that. And then I know I have some, I know Mike has some, and I'm sure each of the panelists have some questions for each other too. So this is from Alyssa Blanco, and she would like to know, from your research, what is the most important takeaway for police? The number one implication for police agencies. Importantly, what should police do based on what you found? So maybe we'll start with you, Jesse.
Yeah, thank you, Eileen, and thank you for the question. I think this is a really good one. So the number one takeaway for me would be, if you're going to take the time to implement this technology, to, fund it and everything, you want to make sure that officers are using it. Make sure officers are turning it on. And then the big thing that I found here is that policy really matters. So if you want to maximize, your chances that officers are using this technology, make sure that your policy is clear about when it should be used, how it should be used, and then how these decisions should be reviewed as well to make sure that officers are using it the way it's intended.
Great, thank you. Vaughn.
Well, in terms of a number one takeaway, particularly looking at the police community relations dynamic, I think it's really important to take the conversation on the road when it comes to how BWCs are being used and how they can be effective. I think that public education piece is extremely important. I would encourage agencies to do public outreach. And when I say public outreach, it should not just be a panel of police talking to community, but there should be a kind of a circle of conversation, including panelists from different protagonists or agencies within the community that the community trusts, and have an open conversation about the use of body-worn camera footage and how it actually can benefit society, how it can benefit the community. I think that's the big takeaway.
Great, thank you so much. Eric.
Yeah, echoing what Jesse and Vaughn were saying, I actually give this answer quite a bit when speaking with police about any type of technology. And my go-to response is, don't treat it like it's a refrigerator. And what I mean by that is, if you're expecting to purchase body cameras, plug it into a wall. You don't plug body cameras into a wall, but you get my sense, right? If you think you're going to get a technology and that it's just going to run itself and you don't have to think about the inner workings of how it's being applied, you're probably going to waste your money. Too many police agencies look at whether or not they could afford a technology, whether or not they have the hardware and software to deploy a technology, and they don't think about things like policy, practice, how it's going to be used in the field until after they actually deploy the technology. So I think the most important thing is for agencies to do all of that work before they actually purchase and deploy technology in the field.
Great, thank you all so much. I have a question, and we heard, sort of like I mentioned in my closing statements there, we heard the refrain of procedural justice and body-worn cameras over and over, and how important procedural justice was, regardless of whether you have body-worn cameras or not. To all of our panelists, do you have suggestions as to how body-worn cameras, procedural justice, and activation, how these policies and training could be intertwined so they're not standalone? You don't just have your body-worn camera policy or your procedural justice or your activation, but you're talking about it in a almost a platform, a context of procedural justice. And this is especially considering some of the very strong results in each of your studies into how procedural justice is important.
Sure, I can go ahead and start. So I think for me, kind of like Eric just mentioned, we can't expect body-worn cameras to run themselves and achieve these goals without, putting the work in. I think he and his team have done a really good job finding ways to code procedural justice from body-worn camera footage. Kind of what we saw in Phoenix is that, supervisor reviews of this footage matters. If we could in some way get supervisors to use these types of checklists that researchers are using, to see if their officers are engaging in these procedural justice behaviors. And I know Mike White has done some body-worn camera footage coding as well. These instruments are out there. If we can build that into, officer performance reviews, we can really, leverage this. We have footage now, we have some kind of way to evaluate this behavior and correct it in training.
Yeah, Jesse's advocacy there for some type of review checklist is spot on, right? While body camera footage reviews are becoming more popular with agencies around the country, my fear and some of the disappointment I felt when looking behind, kind of peeling back the layers of the onions on what some of these reviews is that they're looking for very superficial things, right? So did this officer blatantly break the law or blatantly violates department policy, right? And to me, like if that's all you're looking for, you're not fully leveraging the benefit of this great level of detail that's being recorded. So having some type of review checklist, I love that idea. I think that's a great idea to help police do this type of kind of review and analysis is essentially what it would be on their own for the purpose of educating their officers on things like procedural justice.
Vaughn?
Yeah, I agree with my colleagues. I think we're really hitting the nail on the head here in terms of performance reviews. And I understand Eric's concerns as well. It's really important to consider moving beyond just a kind of a binary legalistic view of what's lawful and what's not, and really develop an understanding of actually treating people with respect. What does that look like? And it's hard to really come up with a way to really create a checklist in terms of what those types of behaviors look like. So I think that if we were to approach this from the police academy level and also try to develop curriculums around how we treat people, how we talk to one another. I recall Michael Gladwell's book from a couple years ago about talking to strangers. We've really forgotten how to talk to strangers. And I think that some of those skills, if we can bring in expertise from across other fields and provide resources for that, I think it will really help police recruits and help in terms of organizational culture change from the ground up. So that's in addition to what my colleague said, which I think was spot on. And I think that there are different ways to approach it.
Great. Thank you so much. Mike, I know you had some questions.
Actually, I see John has his hand up, so I'll defer to John.
So I just wanted to ask a quick question of Eric about, I think your research is, rather than just looking at the effects of BWCs, you're looking at BWCs as a lens for, assessing procedural justice. So taking that to the next step, right? I think you were able to differentiate between officers that seem to use procedural justice maybe sort of organically and those who didn't. Do you think there's any way that you can teach or promote procedural justice, either using the body-worn camera footage as a learning tool or in other ways, sort of improve the practice?
Yeah, I think the way to do it would be to promote some type of sit-down sessions between sergeants and officers or whoever's responsible for viewing the footage and officers, and really going in and frame by frame explaining what was done well from a procedural justice standpoint and maybe what can be improved upon, right? So the NFL draft is coming up, so sports is at the forefront of our mind, right? So not different than what sports teams do with their players, right? I mean, you have a goal for a given play. The play either succeeds or it doesn't, and you're able to tell the lineman what he should have done or the wide receiver that the route was incorrect. And this is how you fix your performance to achieve the stated objective, right? I think that's a pretty good analogy for what we could do with police officers, because despite the fact that we throw around terms like procedural justice, for lack of a more educated term, willy-nilly nowadays, right? That's an extremely complex topic, right? And it's difficult to be quote unquote procedural just all of the time. We're human beings. Police officers are human beings. So using the footage to kind of really pinpoint specific areas for improvements and then helping officers actualize that improvement, I think that's probably an ideal role for body camera footage moving forward.
Yeah, I think could be something simple. I think I saw Chris Magnus present several years ago where he just talked casually about how he uses them for reviews. And there was one officer who was noted for being rude. And he said, I'm not rude. And Chris sat down with him in 5 minutes, showed him the body-worn camera video. And without even saying anything, the guy just basically said, oh yeah, I do kind of come across as an asset. Even that simple things like that might be beneficial. Thanks.
I totally agree.
If I could jump in, I love the football analogy, being a football fan. But I'm going to go back. I'm going to use another analogy, and Jessie mentioned it in her talk. That's the medical analogy, that kind of taking the pill, and that reminds me, or makes me think about, the commercials that we see on TV for the the latest cholesterol drug, and then at the bottom of the screen in tiny print you see, here are all the side effects you're going to get if you take this pill: nausea, weight gain, dizziness, all those things. If we're creating a commercial for body-worn cameras, what are the potential negative side effects that we would have to run at the bottom of the screen? And I came up with this question about 3 minutes ago, so I don't have an answer other than I obviously would probably talk about the cost. But given what we know about the research generally and what we've heard from the three of you this afternoon, are there other potential negative consequences from this technology that we would have to put into that commercial?
Sure. I think one of the big questions that's, kind of been around since the beginning of this technology, and I don't know that we've really settled on an answer, is the issue of privacy. Whether civilians want to be recorded when they're in, very vulnerable positions, which they oftentimes are when they're interacting with the police. I think this is something that, we need to be considerate of and careful about. And something else that, police officers themselves certainly talk about is civilians react to the body-worn camera in different ways. So we expect this civilizing effect, but some of the officers that I've talked to have mentioned that, sometimes civilians will actually act out because they're on camera. They'll try and provoke the officer in some certain way. And so I don't think we necessarily have a full understanding of how civilians are really reacting to this technology in the field. And it's something that I think we do need to be aware of, because it could have unintended consequences without fully knowing.
Sorry, I'm going to take my prerogative as the BWC PIT program person. I really loved your medical analogy. I think it opens up a lot of doors. One of the things that I think of is, the mixed results of body-worn cameras. In some studies, it has no effect on use of force or on complaints. But I think, there's an analogy, I think, with an aspirin, right? If you don't have a fever or a body ache, you can take an aspirin. It won't have any effect. So there are some agencies with very little use of force or very little complaints where that impact's not going to be seen. But there were agencies, I think maybe Rialto in the first study, where they may have had a use of force fever, right? They may not have been moderating use of force well, where other agencies are doing it and you won't expect to see an effect. So the aspirin wouldn't have an effect, it wouldn't expect it to have an effect. I think what we don't see is that, that aspirin may have a preventative effect. We know, for instance, that aspirin can help people who have, predisposed to strokes and heart disease, that it has some preventative effect. So, maybe we don't know, or we could probably find out, but it's speculated that, that body-worn cameras will reduce lawsuits. So that may be the analogy there. But I really liked your medical example. I've been struggling to use my aspirin example, so you gave me an opening to use that. So thanks. Hopefully it was worth it.
All right, Vaughn, I know you've had your hand up.
Yeah, just a quick response to Michael, just to add to what Jessie said so eloquently. One of the things that we ought to really think carefully about, I believe, is the evidentiary value of body-worn camera footage, and just to remember that, the camera can only see what's directly in front of it, right? And so we need to think about, we still need to do good lawyering, right? We still ought to be concerned about reasonableness and understanding that this is a point of view that does not in itself capture 100% of what is happening and all of the issues or factors involved in a particular encounter. And so I think that, some of what we've been talking about before in terms of educating the public, we also need to educate our law enforcement as well as our legal experts in terms of, understanding how to use this as evidence and tempering expectations in terms of, well, this will solve all of our problems. Maybe it won't. And so we still need to do the work around it.
Thank you so much. And we're going to close up with Eric's statement, and then we'll close up the webinar.
Perhaps the next pandemic, I'll remember to unmute myself whenever I need to speak. So just to follow up on Vaughn's point here, right? Like, I think the one side effect is unreasonable public expectations. Vaughn made a great point, right? I mean, like the public expectation is that body cameras let you see what the officer can see. That's just not true, right? These are mounted on the shoulder. Most of the times they're mounted in the chest. It's easy for things to be missed, right? It's easy for key parts of a police citizen interaction to actually go unrecorded just because we are not seeing exactly what the officer wanted to see, right? So I just wanted to kind of follow up on Vaughn's point there, and the point of view one is critical, and it's one that we don't speak about enough.
Great. Thank you so much. Well, this has been a wonderful webinar. I've learned a bunch, and I hope that our participants have as well. I'm going to turn this over to Brittany just to close off and to say any logistical information that she would like to say.
Thank you again, everybody, for joining this afternoon. We will be posting the webinar probably within the week. You will receive an evaluation form again. Please do share your feedback. We use those to inform future webinars. We hope that you found the discussion engaging and innovative and that you learned a lot. So thank you all, and we'll see you on the next one. Thank you. Have a great day.